This is the third episode in the Benson family murders case. After the family matriarch and two of her children became victims of a horrific car bombing, the police began the arduous task of putting together a profile of the family so they could identify anyone that might be responsible. Last week, we started uncovering the dysfunctional family dynamics at play in the Benson clan. After suffering failure after failure, Stephen found himself caught between the opposing factions of a manipulative and overbearing mother and his demanding wife that had already withheld his children from him once. And while Stephen's little brother Scott was the apple of his mother's eye, Scott too had his own issues. And that's where we'll continue with today's episode of the Benson family murders on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes and bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a former firefighter and a fire protection engineer.
And I'm here listening.
So remember, you can always find us on social media or at crimetoburn@gmail.com. Please be sure to review this episode on whatever platform you listen on. And if everyone would just tell one friend to listen, that would be awesome. Also, please, if you haven't listened to the first and second episode of this series, please especially be sure to listen to episode 1. There's some important notes about sources and a few important disclaimers that we hope will prevent us from getting sued. Last week we talked about Stephen, the middle child of the family. And you should definitely go back and listen to that. Make sure you bring your gym shorts.
Warm me back. Oh, yeah. Warm me back up because it's been a week.
So Stephen was the quiet, introverted, enjoyed building electronics, and he wanted to please his dad more than anything. And so when his family decided to adopt a baby when Stephen was 14, he decided to go into business for himself in an attempt to finally win favor with his father. But his businesses were just failure after failure. He married his high school sweetheart and had an affair. He dropped out of college and didn't tell mom and dad and still managed to forge completely realistic-looking grade documents to send to them while they continued to pay his tuition. And so finally his dad gave him a job at Lancaster Leaf soon after his divorce from his first wife, and he met Debbie and brought her back from Wisconsin, still married to her former husband. She got a quickie divorce, they got married, and they had 2 children, which she allegedly kidnapped and took back to Wisconsin with her, and then made Stephen jump through a bunch of ridiculous hoops and promised to do a bunch of completely unrealistic things, like separating Debbie and the kids from his family when he was involved in businesses that he owned with his mother. And so he found himself torn between the 2 controlling women in his life who hated each other. And then they had a third kid.
Diabolical.
Yeah, so that's pretty much where we left off.
All right, I'm with you again.
Okay. Now, Scott Benson, who we know that the Bensons adopted to alleviate anxiety for Mrs. Benson.
If you're feeling anxiety or depression,
add a child to the mix.
Go get a kid. Just go get a kid.
Preferably a newborn.
It doesn't have to be someone you know. It could be at a ballpark.
Crime to Burn does not endorse kidnapping. All right, so Scott, this adopted baby, was the golden boy, the light of his adopted mother's eyes. He was popular, he was athletic, he was so loving towards his mother, and according to Carol Lynn, he was far, far, far more spoiled than she or Stephen ever were, which is saying quite a lot. Because if you recall, Stephen got a motorboat for his 10th birthday, and Carol Lynn got a brand new red convertible for her 16th, and she acted like these were just expected given the fact that they were rich.
She would have been singing a different tune if she would have been the one getting the motorboat.
Oh God, I walked right into that one, didn't I? So Scott could do no wrong in Margaret's eyes, according to Carol Lynn, but man, he sure tried hard to do wrong. Carol Lynn recounted one incident specifically when Scott was very young. She was at her parents' house, and Scott woke up and went downstairs to watch TV on the couch, and Mrs. Benson came downstairs with his clothes, and as he laid there on the couch, not moving his own body of his own volition, she bodily undressed him from his pajamas and dressed him in his clothes, threading his limbs through sleeves and pants, while he just laid there and snapped at her anytime she blocked his view of the TV. The look on your face. If only there was video of this.
He was conscious?
He was conscious. He was just a child. He just didn't want to get dressed. He wanted to watch TV.
Well, yeah. Some kids you gotta help them get dressed.
Carol Lynn made it sound like he was just treated like a king. Like, it wouldn't have been out of character for his mother to, like, fan him and feed him grapes. Kind of relationship.
Oh.
So, Scott grew up with the finest of everything, and a mother that would just plaintively ask for him to change his behavior when he was doing wrong instead of demanding it or, beating his ass, which was perhaps the more common form of child correction in this era.
Would you please stop choking the mailman?
Yeah, even when he might have deserved a good ass beating. And he really tried to deserve those ass beatings. For example, there was the time that he took a hammer to his father's very expensive cherry inlaid desk, and Margaret didn't yell at him. Instead, she just plaintively asked if he would please give her the hammer. Friends.
And then she knocked him upside the head with it?
No, she didn't. No, apparently it became a negotiation.
This was in the 80s?
No,
70s?
This would have been in the late 60s, early 70s.
All right.
Now, friends also reported that when they would go to the pool with Scott when he was like a very young boy at the country club, and they would go to get snacks from the concession stands, he always paid with like $100 bills, which is
like
crazy.
Every time he went up?
I don't know. Just
coming home with mad change.
Now, Scott did not attend the private school that Stephen and Carol Lynn had both attended. He went to public school. And that's where he first became acquainted with mind-altering substances. But even before he went to high school, Scott discovered that he was quite popular with the ladies, and he was reportedly sexually active as young as the age of 12. When Scott did get to this pivotal age where his parents should have been, talking to him about puberty and girls and the dangers of drug abuse, Stephen, Scott's older brother, was still married to Nancy at this point, and since Margaret and Benny had no time for enlightening their youngest son on the myriad of ways he could screw up his life, those difficult conversations somehow became the responsibility of Stephen and Nancy. Now, despite his taste for recreational drugs and girls, Scott was smart. And he finished high school in only 3 years, but that means he was also smart enough to manipulate his parents very effectively. Scott wanted to be a professional tennis player, and he was good, and he might have been able to eke out a moderately successful career, but he lacked the requisite discipline, and he clung to those vices he had with a death grip. But Margaret and Benny fully supported Scott's dreams and threw insane amounts of money, sending him to exclusive tennis camps, paying for really expensive private coaches, and every one of them told the Bensons the same thing. If he's going to have a career in tennis, he's got to learn to be more disciplined. But he never learned.
So you told me last episode that there was no cocaine involved.
I did not tell you that.
Oh.
We'll get to the cocaine.
Oh, we will get
we'll get to cocaine.
We're going to get to the cocaine.
Now, Scott had tennis coaches up and down the East Coast, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Florida, and they all agreed that his aspirations to go pro and be like a top-of-the-line tennis player were pure fantasy. They felt that the best he could probably hope for was to get hired on as a tennis pro at a club, giving lessons to trophy wives and little rich kids like himself. And during high school, Scott ran with what Carol Lynn described as a fast crowd, smoking pot, driving fast cars, throwing wild parties, and with Margaret and Benny bailing him out of whatever scrapes he fell into, or, more often, whatever scrapes he drove into. Now, as Scott got more into fast cars, he discovered that nitrous oxide was not just an excellent product for making the car go faster, but also that it could make him high.
It gives you a great buzz, too, man.
So he reportedly bought nitrous oxide in, industrial quantities.
What's industrial quantity?
I don't know. They didn't give me any like solid numbers here, but here's what everyone that knew Scott, the Benson's housekeeper confirms this. All of Scott's girlfriends confirmed this, and basically anyone they interviewed that knew Scott confirmed this. He kept a tank of nitrous oxide next to his bed so that he could just take hits off of it whenever he wanted.
When a problem comes along.
Now, Scott was only 16 when Benny died, and he and his mother were moved to Florida right after Benny died. Now, like his siblings, Scott also really enjoyed spending his mom's money, but not in the same way as Stephen. Remember, Stephen started a lot of businesses that he ran straight into the ground. Scott liked to spend money on cars and boats. In fact, Mrs. Benson was having a cigarette boat custom made for him when Margaret and Scott were both killed. Now, this would go well with her yacht, which we're going to talk about more later on. But I guess giving Scott a custom-made speedboat, to me, is a puzzling choice, because for the past 5 years leading up to the bombing, Scott had quite the record, and we're just going to hit some highlights. This isn't even the full list, but he had wrecked a van, ruined the suspension in a Lamborghini, gotten in barroom brawls, lost a $10,000 wristwatch left to him by his deceased father, destroyed his mother's antique dining room table with a belt sander while he was high. He earned the nickname Aquaman by driving a truck that he didn't own into a lake, and he destroyed the transmission in the Datsun 280Z that Carol Lynn left in Florida to drive when she was visiting her mother.
They really called him Aquaman.
They did. Mm-hmm. I can only surmise that Mrs. Benson thought maybe buying him a boat would keep him from driving more vehicles into lakes.
Because it'd already be in the lake.
I don't know.
Just saving that step.
But at the rate with which he destroyed things, I feel like if he had just been born a few decades later, he might have been a famous YouTuber.
But a cigarette boat, it's got a whole, like, sleeper cabin and a kitchen galley. And
apparently it wasn't his first one. Apparently he'd had one already. We're going to talk a little bit more about that one. But I read it in one source that he'd already had a cigarette boat that he sold, which we'll talk about in a second. But I couldn't find confirmation that it was a cigarette boat and not just a speedboat. But it was one of the two.
All right.
Now, people that knew Scott during his Florida years all basically have the same impression of him. He was always involved with girls. He was always driving too fast. He'd even gotten a ticket for going 160 in his Lotus. And he was always taking insane volumes of mind-altering substances and leaving a trail behind him of pissed-off people and people that he owed money to. Now, oddly, his drug habit didn't appear to be helping his familial relations with his mother and his siblings, and nor did it seem to be super conducive to the tennis career, which he seemed to aspire to.
How odd.
Weird.
Usually that just launches people into success.
Yeah, no, he was not launching anything except trucks into lakes. Now, his mother did not just allow him, but fully supported him in pursuing a full-time tennis career after Benny died. Now, remember, Benny died when Scott was just 16, and so he went to go study under a tennis pro near St. Petersburg, Florida, and he initially lived in a dormitory at this facility with other students that were also studying tennis there, but his mother soon decided that that wasn't good enough for him and bought him a condo to live in. Scott was 17 at this point. So Scott, being the purveyor of all good decisions, immediately moved his 14-year-old girlfriend, Tracy Mullins, in with him. And Tracy did all the cooking and the cleaning and acted like a, quote, little wife, unquote, because she didn't have to worry about things like school because she had dropped out.
Wait, how old was she?
She was 14.
I thought you said 14.
He was 17.
All right, well, it's barely legal. It's right on the edge there.
But even though Scott described her as living like described their relationship as living like husband and wife, they were far from June and Ward Cleaver. Their entire relationship is littered with police reports of violent altercations, disorderly conduct, and, of course, public drunkenness. And then there's the fact that Mrs. Benson began accusing Tracy of stealing jewelry, outfits, purses, and then eventually even, and I have a hard time picturing this, a big screen TV at one point. This was in the 80s, so big screen TVs weren't like, you could just grab one and run out of the house with it.
Well, people had much bigger pockets in the 80s.
I don't think they were that big. But, like, I'm trying to picture, like, a 14-year-old girl trying to wrestle a big screen TV out.
Like one of those rear projection jobs.
No idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, the Bensons went even further, alleging that Tracy actually was making threats on the lives of the Benson family on multiple occasions when Scott finally ended things with her, and that she was just a complete maniac. Now, Tracy alleges that it was actually Mrs. Benson's controlling and meddlesome nature that ended her relationship with Scott. But for whatever reason, Scott and Tracy break up when Scott left the St. Petersburg area to move to Miami to study under tennis pro Anna Kuykendall in the spring of 1982. And this is when Margaret Benson said that the threats against the family from Tracy really started to ramp up. Now, Scott's coach, Anna Kuykendall in Miami, wasn't just his coach. He actually lived in her home with her and her husband while he was training under her. And she describes Scott as a lovable teddy bear, but also completely irresponsible and possibly emotionally disturbed. Now, she alleges that Tracy Mullins did actually show up in Miami while Scott was training under her, and not only tried to assault Scott, but also tried to assault Anna and her husband. This girlfriend was a little unhinged.
She's stabby.
I don't know that she actually stabbed anybody, but I do believe that there was a report that she was trying to beat people with tennis rackets, which is almost better.
Swatty.
Now, even though Scott had ended things with Tracy, apparently it wasn't really a clean break, and he did see her a few times after they broke up. And so later that year, she turned up claiming to be pregnant with a brand new Benson heir. And at the time of the explosion, Tracy had had a baby girl, which was in the custody of Tracy's relatives as Tracy was in a drug rehabilitation program, and the paternity case that she had filed in 1983 was still pending. Now, eventually, the Kuykendalls were forced to ask Scott to leave because he just would not follow the rules, and he was always in trouble at their house. Now, when Scott left the Kuykendalls in Miami and returned to his mother's home in Naples, Florida, he began studying under the tennis pro Stephen Vaughn. And Stephen had much the same assessment of Scott's tennis abilities as his previous coaches. But he was interested in continuing to work with a kid because getting paid can be very motivating. So he sent Scott to Europe in the spring of '85, right before the explosions, to compete. And the goal of this trip was he was participating in a relatively small tournament, but if he placed, he could get some points with the Association of Tennis Professionals. However, Scott and Margaret cut their trip short for some reason, and there's rumors that it was because Margaret had walking pneumonia and needed to get home because she was getting worse, but there's also rumors that Scott just threw a temper tantrum and wanted to go home. Now, he did not earn the hoped-for points, he didn't place, which was the entire purpose of the trip. Yet despite all that, several months later, Scott announces to his family and his friends that he'd been accepted into the U.S. Open.
Well, congratulations.
Well, he wasn't. This was unequivocally false. He wasn't even in the top 1,000 players in the United States, and the U.S. Open, I think, works with the top 100. And so reporters, hearing that he had been accepted to the U.S. Open after the explosion, called to confirm that he was actually invited, and they didn't even know who he was. They'd never heard of him. I'm not sure who gave Scott this false hope. Now, there is an issue here with the timeline. The two books that I read have different timelines for Scott's relationship with Tracy and his time training with Anna Kuykendall. In the book by Grenia, Anna says that before Benny died, he had called after she had kicked Scott out to beg for Scott to be readmitted to her program before his death, and he told her that he was dying, and she'd almost folded, but her husband put his foot down. But that would have been when Scott was only 16. But it was also reportedly after his relationship with Tracy, which didn't happen until Scott was 17. So I'm not totally sure exactly what the right timeline there is, but the important things to remember are that Scott did have a tumultuous relationship with Tracy. He did get kicked out of Kuykendall's tennis program, and Tracy did file a paternity suit, and she did have a baby. Now, Carol Lynn and Kim Beagle, and Kim Beagle was Scott's girlfriend at the time of his death, both report that the harassing phone calls and threats from Tracy continued all the way up until about 3 to 4 months before the explosion. Now, Scott apparently did have a pretty decent relationship with big brother Stephen, but he harbored a lot of bad feelings for Carol Lynn. He called her selfish and manipulative, which is ironic. And the Benson's housekeeper actually recounted to police an incident of Scott physically attacking Carol Lynn on at least one occasion. But that's not the end of Scott's violent streak. In 1983, so 2 years before the explosion, Scott had been so violent towards his mother that she had started recording their interactions, and she caught an interaction on tape where he threatened to have his fully trained attack dog, Buck, tear her to shreds because she did something with his dog that he disapproved of while he wasn't home. Margaret was in so fear for her life that she felt like she had to record her interactions with her son. The police came, and because of that tape, they actually had Scott committed to a mental hospital for 5 days before psychiatrists deemed him stable enough to return to his home. Now, psychiatrists told his mother, and presumably told Scott, that his heavy use of drugs, especially the nitrous, had permanently affected his brain, causing him issues with regulating his emotions, and that this was a contributing factor in his reportedly increasingly common violent outbursts.
You usually don't hear people using, I guess some people use a lot of nitrous oxide, right? But like that seems like a lot.
I mean, granted, I'm
like
kind
like if you're a dentist listening to this, you get a pass, like, right? Like,
I've never heard of anyone like regularly abusing nitrous. I've heard of it like showing up at parties and stuff, but I don't run with a quote unquote.
It's a weird thing to kind of rely on, right?
Yeah, like I don't run with the kind of people that would regularly use mind-altering substances anyway. So maybe I'm just
I'm probably
naive.
I was going to use that word.
Oh, sorry.
I'm probably just being naive.
So, despite warnings from psychiatrists about how drugs had affected his ability to control his temper, Scott had not learned his lesson. He had his girlfriend Kim essentially living with him in Margaret's house, and Kim also confirms that despite these warnings, Scott continued to abuse drugs, including cocaine, and that yes, there was still a canister of nitrous oxide next to the bed, and he still did use it. Now, are Scott's increasingly violent outbursts and his delusion about being admitted to the U.S. Open perhaps some kind of drug-induced psychosis, for which a custom cigarette boat and a few exploding lotuses were the only cure?
That's good for what ails you.
I guess. There's lots of questions here. There's also allegations that Scott wasn't just using drugs, but that he had also begun to deal drugs. In the process, he allegedly managed to run up some really high debts with the wrong kinds of people. Now, after the explosion, there was one person that was sure the explosion was likely due to Scott's extracurricular activities. And that person was Paul Harvey. And here's the rest of the story.
Oh.
No, not that Paul Harvey. But I just thought it was funny that they do have the same name.
I was trying not to be immature and be like, that Paul Harvey?
That Paul Harvey? No, that was what I first thought when I saw his name. But no, Paul Harvey was the captain of the Galleon Queen, the 36-foot yacht that could sleep 8 that Mrs. Benson owned. Now, when she had bought this exceptionally expensive hole in the water, Stephen exercised his expertise in expense overkill and had $30,000 worth of electronics added to it, including radar, automatic pilot, a depth finder, ship-to-shore telephone, stereo, intercom, and, of course, his favorite, a very elaborate security system.
On a boat?
Yeah. Even the vendors that did the work were absolutely floored at the amount of money that Stephen threw into that boat on top of what came stock.
Oh, no, I'm not going to rabbit trail, but everyone wants to know how you put a security system on a boat.
I don't know. I don't know. They didn't go into the details.
All right.
After Harvey heard about the explosion, he called the police to explain to them that he had some information that investigators should hear. In addition, he was terrified to start Mrs. Benson's boat and wanted it swept for bombs because he was so sure that the bombing had to be related to Scott and a drug deal gone bad, and he believed that it was feasible that the people responsible might have also rigged the yacht. So when investigators arrived, Harvey explained to them that on May 16th, so not quite 2 months before the explosion, Scott had shown up with friends unannounced, demanding that Harvey take them out on the Galleon Queen. Now, Harvey didn't mind this, but as soon as they were out of the marina, he says Scott and his friends immediately began smoking pot and doing cocaine, even though they'd showed up already, and this is, quote, hopped up, loaded, and drunk, unquote. And as they yachted about, Harvey heard them not even trying to be discreet about talking about this, but like boisterously discussing a situation in which they had either ripped off someone or caused someone to lose $200,000. And this was in 1985 money, so if we look at it today, we're talking about over $600,000 in today's money. So that's a pretty good chunk of change to owe somebody, and it could definitely be a potential motive for murder if it's true. And Paul Harvey wasn't the only one that believed Scott was in debt. There was other rumblings that Scott owed the wrong people money. In fact, Carol Lynn herself said to paramedics on the way to the hospital and to the first investigator that interviewed her in the hospital that Kim Beagle's brothers could have been responsible. Remember, Kim was Scott's girlfriend. Kim's brothers were apparently, allegedly, known to be involved in drug dealing. Now, reportedly, Scott had sold one of Kim's brothers his boat because, after all, Mummy was having a new one built for him. Now, the brother and Scott had agreed to a purchase price, and the brother had only paid Scott $10 of the $14,000 agreed upon when he wrecked the boat. So at this point, he refused to pay any additional money, and Carol Lynn told investigators that she'd heard that they were hiding the boat from Scott so he couldn't repossess it. Now, Scott really did owe the wrong people money. Getting screwed out of that $4,000 by Kim's brothers could have definitely been a source of intense friction between Scott and Kim's brothers, but was it enough for murder? But Carol Lynn even mentioned to investigators that Wayne Kerr was supposed to be writing, or supposed to have written, a letter, because if there's one thing that people in these illicit lines of work respond to, it's a strongly worded missive about about either paying the rest of the money or letting Scott repossess the boat. Before we go any further, we have to go back to Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. Please don't sue me. You recall that Harvey wanted the Galleon Queen swept for explosives because he was terrified to start it. Well, after investigators heard the story that he told them, they decided it wasn't really of particular interest for whatever reason, and they only did like a very cursory sweep for explosives, basically like sticking their head in the hold kind of a sweep, which this really made Harvey mad. So he gave the keys of the boat to investigator Wayne Graham, and he asked him, if you're not really going to check the boat over for bombs, then you go start it. So Harvey gets off the boat and goes and stands like a good distance away, and Wayne goes up to the bridge, and he stood there and pondered his life for a moment, and then returned and handed the keys back to Harvey, having not started it. He later was asked about this, and he said, and I quote, "I just didn't think the best way to search for bombs was for me to go switching on the motor."
Although it may be the quickest way to find it.
Quick. So clearly, even though the police appeared to mostly dismiss Harvey's concerns, they were still somewhat concerned. But Harvey ended up having to hire an electronics expert to go over the boat to see if it was wired to explode. Now, what do you think that help wanted ad would have said? Feeling reckless and short on cash? Come enjoy the day on a custom-built yacht and get paid to take part in an adrenaline-pulsing scavenger hunt.
Was it the red one or the green one? The red one or the green one? I can't remember.
Anyway, the boat was not wired to explode, and it did not. Now, there's one thing about Scott's life that, according to Carol Lynn, remained a mystery to him for his entire life: the identity of his birth parents. However, after the explosion, when investigators interviewed Carol Lynn, she revealed that her parents had adopted Scott after she had given birth to him while she was in college. Carol Lynn was Scott's birth mother.
What?
Yes. Even Margaret's own sister, that lived right around the corner from Margaret and Benny, reported that the Bensons had never once revealed that Scott was Carol Lynn's baby. However, apparently in Lancaster there had been some rumors questioning whether or not the baby might have been Carol Lynn's, but the family never breathed a word of it to anyone, and supposedly Scott never knew that his big sister was the one that had given birth to him. Remember, this woman that he loathes. Or did he? So in Carol Lynn's senior year, back when she wasn't invited to participate in cotillion, she found herself suddenly ostracized from her social circle, and things just sort of seemed to stack up against her, according to her accounting in John Greeny's book. Now, she indicated that the only college she wanted to attend was Vassar, but she was denied early admission, and she believes that some teacher at her high school that didn't like her called to have her acceptance pushed out to regular spring admission. But Carol Lynn's high school advisor denies any knowledge of anything like this happening, but he accepts that maybe at some point somebody told Carol Lynn this was the case, or that at any rate Carol Lynn believed it. So in a fit of frustration, Carol Lynn gave up on Vassar and accepted an offer to attend Goucher, where her mother had attended. But during this senior year, where she suddenly has no social life, Carol Lynn met a young man that is identified in John Greeny's book only as Brett. and John Grenier makes it clear that this is not his real name. Now, Brett was attending college in Delaware, but soon after meeting Carol Lynn during her senior year, he was spending most of his time in Lancaster, keeping the now socially isolated Carol Lynn entertained. Now, Brett tells Grenier that when Benny was traveling for work, Margaret actually allowed him to sleep in Carol Lynn's room with her, that Margaret even seemed to think it was cute that the two of them were so infatuated with each other, which is kind of gross. However, Carol Lynn denies this, saying that her mother was much too old-fashioned and had, Victorian values and would never have approved of any woman, especially her, having those kinds of relationships before marriage. Now, Brett asked Carol Lynn to marry him right before she graduated from high school, and Carol Lynn accepted. However, she broke things off shortly thereafter. But again, it doesn't sound like it was a clean break, because Carol Lynn did travel to Delaware sometime during her freshman year of college after she broke off their engagement, and apparently it was quite a romantic weekend, as we'll find out. However, after that, Carol Lynn says she realized things with Brett were just never going to work out, and so she just completely ended things with Brett, and he took it really hard. So hard that he had to bury his sorrow in one of the most intense rebounds I have ever heard of, and just weeks, I think he said 2 weeks after getting dumped, he married his new girlfriend.
2 weeks?
2 weeks. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't long after he marries his new girlfriend that he hears from Carol Lynn, only now she's explaining to him that she is pregnant with his baby. Obviously newly married, this is displeasing news to him. So when the Bensons reach out to him to discuss the matter, he is hoping for an easy out, and they give him one, in the form of legal papers to consent to have the baby put up for adoption. He signs those papers, and he returns to life with his new bride. So the Bensons sent Carol Lynn to live with her Aunt Pauline, and her friends at school thought she was at home with a severe case of mono, and her friends in Lancaster thought she was off at college, but she was busy incubating and then birthing her first child, and Scott was born on Christmas Day, 1963, during Carol Lynn's sophomore year of college. Carol Lynn says she absolutely did not want to give Scott up for adoption. She wanted to keep him. But reportedly, her parents would hear nothing of the sort. So after Scott was born, the Bensons told Carol Lynn their plan. They would adopt Scott, and once she finished college on her own and got herself established, they would let her have Scott back.
What?
Now, this smacks of suspicion to me. If that was the case, then why the big secret about Scott's origin and not telling anyone, even Margaret's own sister, that Scott was Carol Lynn's baby? And wouldn't Carol Lynn have blabbed at some point? So I have a suspicion, albeit completely unsubstantiated, and I have no proof of this, that perhaps Carol Lynn was maybe a little more complicit here than just her parents taking Scott and protecting her reputation. I feel like maybe she was also concerned about her reputation, because all through high school, she told all her friends her main goal was to marry a businessman like her daddy, and as an unwed mother, she was probably not going to be at the top of the eligible bachelorette list. Plus, Carol Lynn, like Stephen, hadn't ever really had to solve any of her own problems, because she'd never really had any until she fell pregnant. So this seems to me like one more of the Bensons' incidents of just bailing out their children and showing them that every problem can be solved with enough money and enough zipped lips.
And cocaine.
Now, Grenier interviewed this man we know as Brett, and Brett reported that he had only met Scott on one occasion, when Scott was about 2 years old. Brett's little rebound marriage had already failed, and Carol Lynn contacted him, and he agreed to see her and to meet his son. He was really excited to hear from Carol Lynn again. She was always the one that got away for him. And they had agreed to keep in touch, and Brett seemed to think that they might be able to rekindle things, but the day after he met with Carol Lynn, Carol Lynn's dad, Benny, called him, and in no uncertain terms explained that he should not try to reach out to Carol Lynn again because the potential scandal it could cause. Now, was Benny trying to protect Carol Lynn and her reputation, or was he trying to protect Margaret, since she'd reportedly become so obsessed with this baby? Unfortunately, Benny's dead, and he can't answer that question for us, but I think it's a reasonable possibility that it might be a little bit of both. So Carol Lynn, she did finish college, and then she went to her parents to ask about their deal and getting little Scotty back. But her dad reportedly told her that he was sorry he was going to have to go back on the deal he made because it would hurt Margaret too much to give up that baby. because she adored him.
Sorry, I know it's your baby and all, but you can't have it?
Yeah. I mean, she had signed adoption papers over to her parents. So in order for her to get custody of the baby back, she would have had, since she signed the adoption papers, she would have had to legally proven that it wasn't in Scott's best interest, that they were intentionally trying to harm him in some way for her to apply for custody that long after he'd been born.
I see.
So after finishing her degree at Goucher, Carol Lynn enrolled in law school at American University. However, she heard from an old boyfriend from before she'd gotten involved with Brett, and this boyfriend was currently living in Texas, so Carol Lynn flew down to see him. And one trip was all it took for he and Carol Lynn to decide they were madly in love and wanted to get married. So she immediately switched schools to a law school in San Antonio, and her parents sent her off to a new life in San Antonio with a new fiancé, a fully furnished luxury apartment, and a brand new Corvette.
Very nice.
Her friends in Texas recall that Carol Lynn was always complaining about how her family used to hold money over her head, which obviously appears to coincide with how the family friends recount the Bensons' relationship to their children throughout their lives. However, her relationship with her new beau broke up relatively quickly, and it turned out that law school wasn't a very good fit for Carol Lynn either, because she dropped out after only a year and a half. However, in that year and a half, Carol Lynn met a handsome young athlete named Tom Kendall, who was reportedly a better fit for Carol Lynn, or so she thought. Tom was actually a world champion water skier, which I didn't know was a thing.
These are the whitest people ever. Get tennis players, water skiers, driving around in a Lotus and doing cocaine.
So Carol Lynn left law school, and Tom and Carol Lynn were married in November of 1968, and they planned to move to San Francisco because supposedly Tom had a job there waiting for him. So they took the money Grandpa Benson gave him for their wedding, moved across the country, and however, just weeks after their wedding, Carol Lynn reportedly caught him making out with another woman at a New Year's Eve party that they were attending together.
Was there mistletoe?
I don't know.
That might have been that. Just maybe there was just some mistletoe.
I don't think that really excuses
because if
that
there
kind of
is,
behavior.
you gotta. Like,
No,
it's a rule.
you don't. You're not allowed to go to any more parties where there might be mistletoe. Okay, so they made the move. They drove across the country to San Francisco, and it turns out when they got there was actually no job waiting for Tom. So Carol Lynn had to support them with the money that her family had given her for their wedding gifts, and that just didn't last long. Now, based on this timeline, I have to suspect that the reason for the quickie wedding was that Carol Lynn may have already been pregnant when she married Tom, but that's not specifically indicated in any of the books. But once the couple quickly went broke on the West Coast, Carol Lynn was now expecting a baby, and so the Bensons jumped in to save the day and moved Tom and Carol Lynn back east, where Carol Lynn gave birth to the couple's first son. Well, soon after the baby was born, Tom got his chance to take part in the family dynasty at Lancaster Leaf, working a menial job. Carol Lynn was soon pregnant again with their second child, and one day she and her mother were out while she was pregnant with the second child, and she came home to find her husband, poof, disappeared, gone, never saw him again. So 13 months to the day after she married him, she was served with divorce papers, and now she has a son and is pregnant with a second one. There was some rumors that maybe Carol Lynn wasn't faithful to Tom during their marriage, but there's no proof of that at all. So I don't know if that's true or not.
This is starting to sound like a lot of gossip.
Right? It is. Now, as a single mom of two, Carol Lynn continued to live in a house owned by Mommy and Daddy, and she apparently did make several attempts to support herself, but ultimately she basically lived by the purse strings of Mom and Dad because she was raising two boys by herself, and logistically it was reportedly just too much for her to hold down a steady job and raise her boys, and every single mom listening to this just pulled a muscle rolling their eyes.
And at the same time, they know it's actually true.
It is hard, yes, but she also, remember, she is getting a monthly income from the trust that she inherited from her grandmother, which would be more than enough to pay for rent and groceries, and so she could have chosen to live a less lavish lifestyle and probably been fine. But that's not how she's grown up, and she's not ready to make those sacrifices. However, not one to pass up a chance to look a gift horse in the mouth, Carol recounts this period of her life when she was living rent-free with her kids and had a never-ending fountain of support at her back as one of the hardest times of her life. This is because apparently her parents were not treating her boys with the same overt excesses that they were treating Scott, and she reports that her boys saw this as unfair because Scott was giving excesses and privileges that they were not.
I can't even put myself in that headspace. I have no idea what that's crazy.
Now, there is one really amusing story from this time, and I gotta tell you. So, Carol Lynn was living right across the street from Mom and Dad, and apparently at some point there was a break-in at her house. Now, Carol Lynn was reportedly not a very good housekeeper, because when the police arrived, they were like, oh, wow, not only did you have a break-in, but they ransacked the house. And she had to admit that, no, the house always looked like that.
She should have been like, yes, they did.
And you know what? I can't really say anything. Like, I'm not a good housekeeper. I'm not even going to pretend.
You make a good pie.
Thanks.
You can go in the kitchen without your shoes.
Mm-hmm.
It's great.
Yeah.
You're fine.
Carol Lynn also reports that because she couldn't afford to take her boys on family vacations unless she tagged along on her parents' family vacations, she was expected to do all the cooking and cleaning and laundry for the entire family on these vacations. I guess that she was just too tired between vacations to clean her own house.
I find vacations to be exhausting.
They are, and I'm not judging. Like, you live the way you want to live. But I just found the poor me I had to clean on vacation while I was living rent-free off Mom and Dad, being manipulated for my livelihood. It just felt a little thick at this point. And despite the stress and dysfunction in the relationship, Carol did report that no matter how far out on a limb she got, her parents were always there to step in, just not without strings attached. And apparently through the years, Carol Lynn and her mom, they spent times super close and times where they were completely on the outs with each other. But ultimately, Carol Lynn loved her mother dearly, and she especially loved her father. And she was always described as the daddy's girl, and his death hit her extremely hard. Now, in 1982, Carol Lynn moved to Boston to go to grad school, and Mother apparently did not approve of this. She thought Carol Lynn should be focused on finding a new husband, something that she didn't seem to have a great track record at doing. But Carol Lynn went against Mom's wishes, and Mom still bought her a condo in Boston for her to go back to school. The problem is that the condo wasn't actually ready when it was supposed to be, and it became this big, huge thing that actually resulted in a big lawsuit that I'm not going to get into. But for a while, Carol Lynn had actually buckled down and live on a budget with 2 kids and find a place to live on her own. And while she did have the money from her grandmother's trust, this was probably the one period of time in Carol Lynn's life where she actually, made the best attempt at, really making a go of things on her own. But she could still call her mom and dad when she was up to her eyeballs in debt. And she did. But, I gotta give her credit for trying here. Well, Carol Lynn was actually still living in Boston when the bombings occurred. But she visited Florida frequently enough that she kept a car in Florida, her Datsun 280Z, that Margaret had bought for her to use while she was there, and Scott had trashed the transmission on before his death. And she was obviously there when the bombings occurred. As we know, she was severely injured. However, it did not take long for police to exclude Carol Lynn as a suspect. Not only was she severely injured, but she was literally sitting right on top of the second bomb in the Suburban. The first bomb was in the center console between Margaret and Scott, and this is the bomb that injured Carol Lynn. And she got out of the car before the second bomb exploded, but that second bomb had literally been right underneath her seat. Now, it's unknown if the 2 bombs were supposed to explode simultaneously, or if the one under Carol Lynn maybe failed to initiate, and it was actually the heat of the fire from the first bomb that caused it to subsequently explode. But it really seems unlikely that it was on any kind of timer and that there was an intentional delay between the 2 bombs. But it can't be ruled out, and this was a possibility, so cops did look at Carol Lynn as a potential suspect. However, I have to agree that despite the problems we're going to get into with Carol Lynn's testimony here very soon, it seems impossible to believe that Carol Lynn would have put herself in that kind of danger if the motive was money. Maybe possible if it was a botched murder-suicide attempt, but even with her complicated relationship with her mother and their issues in the past, Carol Lynn was helping her mom with plans for the new house that Margaret wanted to build and was staying with her in Florida, and neighbors in Florida all report that Carol Lynn and Margaret were in a close, loving relationship at the time of the bombings. So, now we need to look at all the other suspects on the next episode. That's where we're going to leave this one.
It's a lot of new information.
Yes, it is. But this concludes our family background. From here, we're going to go into the investigation, the suspects, and the trial 2 or 3 more episodes, I think. It's maybe 5 or 6 parts total. I don't know. I don't want to give too much away before we get into the bombshells that come out in the investigation and the case from here. But, I mean, the police did have a lot of suspects to exclude. First of all, you know, they did have to investigate the potential that this was related to Scott owing people money and Scott's drug debt. And there's some hilarious stories that come out of that.
Now, if we're talking about some 80s cocaine drug stories.
Yes.
That's going to be interesting. I was disappointed.
You're disappointed there wasn't enough cocaine?
I was strangely disappointed when I thought what you had said was there wasn't any cocaine going on.
No, there was cocaine. And apparently car bombings were, in the 80s, a retaliation measure of choice among...
I've seen Miami Vice.
Drug mafia people. I don't know. I don't have a lot of...
Don Johnson probably replayed this story. You don't even know.
Probably. Maybe we should check Miami Vice later.
We should go back and watch every episode just in case they made some allusion to.
But, you know, so we're going to look at some of Scott's contacts. There's going to be some problems with Carol Lynn's testimony that we're going to have to get into. You know, obviously they're going to look at Stephen because he was the only one that wasn't injured in the bombing. They're going to look at other people that had a financial motive that I haven't gone into yet with you. But ultimately, this entire case ends up hinging on one piece of hard evidence and everything else is circumstantial.
Well, I can't wait to hang off of this cliff for the next week.
Well, you won't have to hang off of it for the next clip, for the next week, but our listeners will, yeah.
They don't know that. I could have got sympathy points with the audience just now.
Okay, I'm sorry. You're going to have to hang on, baby.
I'm trying to be relatable. How do I do it?
So we'll start getting into the suspects and why they were suspects next week, and then we'll get into the investigation and the trial.
Well, thanks for sharing.
I hope you're enjoying it.
I am. It's a lot to think about.
There's a lot there. And I think that the family dynamic... I know we spent a really long time on family dynamics here, but I think it was really important before we get into the court case to understand. Like, I felt a huge, tremendous amount of sympathy. Is that the right word? Sympathy for the position that Stephen was in between his mom and his wife. Like, that would grate on anyone, and I just imagine it probably sucked the life force right out of him. And even though he was a screw up and he made some really bad decisions in his life, and, you know, he just seemed kind of like in his own world of non-reality when it came to like business decisions. Like, I don't think he was a bad guy. Like, I think he just was stuck in an impossible situation.
You can hurt people by helping them too much.
You can. And guys, never use money and gifts and objects to manipulate your children. Just don't.
Or anybody, really. That's gross.
Or anybody, yeah. It's just, this is the kinds of...
Unless it's funny, then do it.
Dysfunctional, codependent family dynamic that's born out of those kinds of family relationships.
You feel better now you give the world a little PSA?
No,
Listen,
not
kids.
really.
Listen, kids. When you have a trust fund, don't be an asshole.
All right. What do you want to go do now?
I'm going to play some virtual golf. I'm going to work on my putter.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us. And remember, fire is not your fault unless you start the fire. Remember, all the fires that you didn't start are basically like fires you put out. Only you can prevent forest fires. Only you can start them also.
No PSAs about car bombs or exploding lotuses?
I want to drive it into the ground. We've got 3 more episodes.
I see what you did there. Drive it into the ground.
Oh,
Oh, clever. All right.
Adieu.
We'll see you next week. I have a tendency to fidget.
Fidget.
I need silent fidgets. Nobody can hear you because you're really far away from the microphone.
Fidget. And we can count down the minutes until my ass falls asleep.
Is that why you get so fidgety at the end of recording? Your ass falls asleep? Do you need
It does, like half my whole ass.
Do you want one of these more comfy chairs? They're padded.
No, I don't want to move them about. I feel like I need a barrier between us to keep me safe.
You need a barrier from your wife?
Sometimes.
It's not much of a barrier. There's this big opening in the middle.
Are you saying you could just smash right through
I
it
could
easy?
just
Like, I'm
Hulk
really not
smash.
as safe as I think.
No. Well, the artillery's on my side.
No time for your shenanigans. No time for your tomfoolery. I'm wearing my tighty whities and I've been marked safe from exploding lotuses.
Is that the well pump has some things to say? There we go.
It said,
That's how you should introduce yourself.
"Hi, my name's..." Took my Centrum Silver. Now I'm feeling a little lightheaded.
From the Centrum Silver?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I took,
How much did you take? I don't think you're supposed to take that much. And that's where we'll continue today with our...
Ooh.
See?
We're going to get one of those.
Yeah, we're going to get one of those. All right. Okay, well, I'm not begging. I'm just suggesting.
You were just now on the ground, on your knees, your hands raised up towards the microphone.
I was not.
You look like you're going to cry.
No, I don't. I do not. Oh, are you okay? Was that the ammo box? Skipped a paragraph. Rewind.
How did she get pregnant with the second one?
You know what? I'm going to explain that to you off the air.
It's crazy.
Well, if I burp in the middle, you know what happened.